Welcome to our June 18th webinar as part of our 2025 Resilience by Learning series. Today we're going to be talking about increasing the resilience of your crisis management and communications capability. I am Linda Nelson. I'm the founder and president of I-Corps, and actually I helped to write the international standard ISO 223, 60, and 61 on crisis management communications. And so some of our content is from that today. This series is part of our Resilience by Design learning series, where our webinars are available monthly and on demand. Obviously, you've all registered to attend this webinar. If you have missed any of the other ones, they are available to you both on YouTube and on our website. So far this year, we have been in February, we talked about how to determine the context of your resilience strategy, how to operate as a more agile organization in order to build more flexible and agile systems. Then we looked in April at building or implementing a systems approach to managing risk. Last month, we had a guest speaker and we talked about the global impact of DORA. Today, like I said, we'll be talking about crisis management and communications. Next month, business continuity, then your IT systems, then our supply and value chains, looking at our security systems in October, and finishing up in November with considering the impact of geopolitical risk. For our agenda and outcomes today, we were going to be starting by talking about a new word, the era of a permacrisis, and what is a crisis for your organization. Then we'll be looking at crisis readiness and how you should be prepared ahead of time, how you should be using an inclusive and collaborating approach, looking at those enabling behaviors, and finishing up with communication strategies and how you protect your organization's reputation. Like always, the recording of the webinar should be available on our webinar page by Friday or at the latest on Monday. If you have questions, use the questions button. What I'll do is check in with the questions when we do our polls today, and you'll have time at the end as well. You do need to attend at least 35 minutes to get a certificate. So if you can't finish up today and you get pulled away, just let us know then and watch the recording. So our outcome of today, what is it that we're looking at? We want to ensure that strategies exist to effectively analyze situations, make difficult decisions, and be able to communicate with all relevant interested parties before, during, and after a crisis. I want to start today with some strategies and some strategic objectives. I had trouble with that. And so what we want to be able to do is to have both the capability and the capacity to manage crises that impact the organization's viability and integrity. As part of that, we need to identify teams and their authority levels, and they need to be given the authority to act in a flexible manner. They also need to be adaptable. So this idea of adaptability is identified as a key teamwork competency. We also need to be able to identify a crisis. What is it? So everybody's on the same page about when we escalate to activating our crisis management team. So what constitutes a crisis for the organization? And that should consider the input of all of the interested parties. So here we're looking at those enabling behaviors of inclusiveness and collaboration. And then finally, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, as our stakeholders are part of our interested parties, but this should really inform our planning efforts. And here we're looking at those behaviors of being both diverse and integrated. For our fourth objective, we have continuous learning. We need to be continuously learning, reviewing what worked, what didn't, and updating our plans. And here our enabling behaviors are being aware and reflective. We also need to make sure that we have adequate and available resources, and that the crisis team utilizes those resources and being able to improvise as needed as well. And here we're having the behaviors of being resourceful, creative, and innovative. And finally, looking at objective 6, that you have those plans and procedures documented, and that so you've got those plans so that you can use them, and that those plans themselves are meeting those stakeholder expectations. And to finish up with that, those enabling behaviors are being prepared, robust, and redundant. So, excitement. What was the 2020 word? Collins Dictionary Word of the Year. I know you're all waiting with anticipation to find out what that is, and it is permacrisis. I actually added the capital in this for the C, for the crisis part of it. This idea that we feel like we're permanently in crisis. And I would say that that's more relevant today even than it was in 2022. So it's a term that that's supposed to describe an extended period of instability and insecurity that often results from a series of interconnected crises. Like I said, I feel like today it's just one long crisis event. We kind of just move, we don't even move from one to the other. We just keep adding them. And this really becomes characterized by a sense of ongoing challenges and a feeling that you're caught in a cycle of difficult events with no clear real end in sight. In fact, when you look at images for permacrisis, what you mostly see are people that are very depressed and despondent. So this idea that it's a permacrisis is about having extended instability. So it isn't a single event or a single incident, but it's rather a prolonged state of both that uncertainty and insecurity. That those crises are interconnected, there's multiples of them and they're intertwined, and they impact various aspects of your life, whether it's your work life or your personal life or both. There's a perceived lack of resilience in the systems and that what's happening we're not prepared for. I talked about that psychological impact, that we're constantly facing negative events and feeling overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. That takes a psychological toll on each of us. And it's beyond an individual crisis. We talked about interconnected crisis, but it's beyond those individual, and that the current state of affairs really represents a more fundamental and enduring period of difficulty. And so now if I've gotten you all cheerful, um, I would like you though to take this and see this era of permacrisis as a call to action. That we need to have a comprehensive and collaborative solutions in order to navigate those complex issues. And so let's look at this as it is a now or never type of situation, but we can't just wait for it to be over. We have to start doing something about it. So what I've kind of done is rearranged what I might have in here as crisis scenarios and put them into an order generally of what are some new crises that are experiencing. And we are experiencing financial instability. And a lot of this has been caused by the US. And I'm going to be giving US examples. I live in the US. I'm a US citizen. I live in Chicago. And tariffs and financial instability, not knowing what's going to happen next, is making a difference. We've got wars, we've got geopolitical risk, we've got political polarization. And I'm talking about this firsthand. And when we, in October, put together our agenda for the webinars, I at no point thought that our November webinar was going to be as relevant as it is today. In fact, the idea came from a conference that I participated in Australia, and they were talking about geopolitical risk. And I'd always thought about that as being about wars. And now I do think that it's gone well beyond that. It can result in a war, but geopolitical risk and political polarization around the world, not just in the US, is having an impact. But the US is obviously a point for that. I don't know about in all the countries represented here today, but because of immigration policy in the US, we have labor and workforce issues. We've had labor and workforce issues before about getting quality people. Now we're just looking for people to do the work that needs to be done. We've always talked about natural disasters, but now climate change. I'm using environmental issues instead of the word climate change, in case anyone's sensitive to the fact that maybe you don't believe in climate change, but environmental issues are impacting the level and number of natural disasters. We continue to face increasing cybersecurity issues. And just looking at the impact of technology failures, how that has changed really shuts us down. I mean, if you don't have email working and you can't communicate, people go crazy, and for good reason. Also, a lot of legal and regulatory landscapes have been changing. We also added in here, and I could have put this earlier, but I didn't want to be too crazy, but this idea of malevolence. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that malevolence is, by parts of the US government, is causing crises for many, many people. And I'm going to give a personal family crisis. My son and my daughter-in-law are both scientists. They work in immunology, infectious diseases. They have their careers built around that. Their funding comes completely from the National Institutes of Health here in the US, and they're at risk for losing their funding anytime. Most of their peers have lost their funding. There's no reason for that other than policy that doesn't seem to make sense. And then one of the larger risk pieces that have been coming out is really failure to adapt to changing circumstances. That if we're not managing change as it's coming and managing change that's coming faster and faster, we're actually responsible for mismanagement and failure for our organization. Some of the more normal, I'll say, crisis scenarios are things like, physical and security, people dealing with human resources and safety issues. For public relations, recalls, business and marketing type issues. Just think about Boeing as an example, not just in the recalls, but just in the trust of the equipment. Also, your leadership having governance issues or malfeasance issues or negligence all impacts our reputation. And so crisis scenarios usually all culminate in some sort of a reputational issue. So let's talk about defining a crisis for your organization. This seems like it should be something very simple. Is it a crisis or not? But sometimes it's tough to tell whether this is just something that's going to move through and blip from a catastrophe and really become a crisis in the making. And so it really is a challenge for this. And in fact, a lot of times it has been documented that it isn't a crisis yet, but top management says, oh yeah, we got to deal with this now, even though the plans say that you don't. So kind of a broad definition of a crisis is that it's anything that affects the short or long-term survival of the organization or affects the reputation of the brand itself. So you can ask yourself, can I imagine this crisis putting us out of business or trashing our hard-earned reputation? If that answer is yes, you're in a potential crisis and you need to start acting on it. Or there's always the media test. Will reporters or social media take an interest in this problem? And just a hint, anything involving children, public safety, or the environment usually has crisis written all over it. But when you're looking at what would be a crisis for your organization, consider predictability. Was this crisis foreseeable? Is this something that we plan for? Do you expect the duration of this crisis, or I'll call it an incident, to actually cause you a crisis? And is the onset at a time when the organization is vulnerable? So if you're in this, if you're in the, you're in the industry and you're selling things at the holidays, you want those things to be available when you need them. So a supply chain issue could make you very vulnerable if you don't get what you need in time to make those sales. Also, urgency or pressure. What level of pressure is there to resolve it? Is it something top of mind? And then back to kind of our initial question is, does it potentially threaten the existence of our organization, and to what extent have we prepared for it? If you have planned for things that might potentially impact your organization, then you might not, it might not be a crisis because you're ready for it. So this idea of crisis readiness we're going to talk about. Also, we're back to the thought about public media or stakeholder scrutiny. What level of attention could it bring to the organization? Years and years and years ago, ICOR had a issue with a training partner that relationship had ended, and that training partner went on social media and said a lot of things that weren't true, but it doesn't really matter because you can say whatever you want on social media. And I immediately thought we were in a crisis, and I went to our public relations expert who actually writes our crisis communication planner course content, and said, what should we do, John? What should we do? And he says, well, how much attention are these posts getting? And we monitored it for several days. And I thought, wow, several days. I'm like, we should be monitoring this every minute. And what we saw was there wasn't a lot of engagement. While the posts were being made, there wasn't people engaging back. And so the answer was, Linda, if ICOR starts engaging, it's going to become a crisis. Just let it go. And oftentimes we talk about how not engaging actually gives you a crisis because you wait too long. But sometimes not engaging is the actual answer. So having a way to analyze that negative attention. We've talked about, I mentioned already, this idea of manageability through established plans and procedures. If we've already prepared for this and we're able to manage it, then we're probably okay and it's not a crisis. We still need to respond, but let's use our plans and procedures to do those. But oftentimes, what we do know is that crises are oftentimes preventable, or at least they can be mitigated. And oftentimes, crises are actually caused by your own organization, your own self. And this is the result is that loss of trust or negative impact to your reputation and brand. So when you're looking at defining a crisis for your organization, consider lack of planning, being unprepared, lack of governance, where you've got flaws in supervision, or poorly managed incidents, where you've got failure to escalate, that you've got historical documentation of that, or poorly trained personnel, where you've got failure to learn from the past, threats of a corporate takeover, a blame culture, unrealistic schedules, and personnel shortages, just asking people to do too much, that these themselves might become a crisis for your organization. So let's pause here for a minute. I'd like you to take the first poll, and you're going to answer the question, to what extent has your organization identified its crisis scenarios and defined when it's in a crisis? So here we're giving you 5 choices, and I'm assuming people are going to be kind of in the middle. So I generally do 3 for choices, but I went for 5. I wanted to see how many of you were totally all over it, and how many of you were really very old school and haven't moved on. So I'm going to give you about 3 more seconds to vote. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the voting. I am really encouraged by that 14% of you that are all over it. This is amazing. Congratulations. And then really everybody else is right in that, I'd give you a 4 or a 3, and there's only that 3% of you that are both, in that needing to update your plans and strategies, or are still kind of stuck planning for natural disasters. And one of the things I didn't share at the front end is, what kind of work do you do? So my guess is if you're in the business continuity space, maybe that's the focus, is natural disasters, where if you're a crisis management person, you might have more of these in place. So thank you for sharing that. So let's look next at kind of the 6 core components of crisis readiness. So it really gets down to the organization's ability to respond quickly, leadership's awareness of the organization's crisis management, I'll call it repertoire, also their access to that repertoire, how adequate, how, is the planning in itself. You could have things in place, but they're not very good. How well do you respond to the media? What kinds of plans do you have in place for that? And what's that perceived likelihood of a crisis striking the organization? It seems like those organizations that have experienced more crises actually are much better prepared, because just having experience makes you more competent. But I wanted to give you an example of this awareness and access. So years ago, when I was a consultant, we were asked to come in and do an exercise that would last all day. And we started with it happening very, very in the early mornings, before anybody was starting work, before the sun was up, and starting with that incident response team, and then the escalations during the day as that crisis got bigger and bigger, and they had to escalate it up to the crisis management team. So one of the reasons we were brought in was because everyone was engaged, everyone knew what they were supposed to be doing. They had a really good program, except for the top management. The people who were supposed to be on this crisis management team at the very top levels were not. And they wouldn't give the people time. So literally, you don't listen to the people within, you go to a consultant. So they essentially paid us to go in there at a pre-scheduled time, which was a time when these leaders met once a month for lunch. So we got that lunchtime. They were actually eating lunch during our meeting, and we brought this escalation to them. We made them aware that there was this incident happening. And the first thing that they did was just shoot from the hip and use instinct. Okay, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do this. And we said, well, just in case you weren't aware, here's the plans that we have in place for this type of a crisis. So number one, we made them aware. And we had the internal people weren't able to do that. Hiring somebody from outside to give that messaging that would you just pay attention to what's already done was really important. And then we gave them those plans and we showed them how to access them online and how to access them all different ways. And then we then asked them, based on these documented plans and procedures, how should we proceed? And what we found, and to really our delight, was that they self-discovered that what was documented for them was much better than what they were going to do shooting off the hip. And then they took some of their ideas of what they had, and then they went in and they updated those plans and procedures. And so sometimes it's not easy. That awareness and access can be a big deal. Melissa Agnes had put together years ago something that I still find very useful tool, which is kind of these 5 phases of becoming crisis readiness. It's like a pyramid, it's very typical, but it's looking at the mindset, skills, and tools required to really put together this crisis ready culture and build that brand. So looking at it from a beginning, the mindset or culture piece. What is your current mindset for viewing and responding to negative events and its current processes and levels of preparedness? So doing that audit, doing that analysis and review. And then identifying what's our baseline of understanding for everyone who's going to be involved in implementing this program or who's been involved with the implementation. Let's look at a snapshot of that and make sure that everybody's aware and understands it. And then digging a little bit deeper into that knowledge base and saying, have we identified the most high impact and most likely types of scenarios that are going to pertain to us? And do we understand those expectations and demands of our stakeholders in each of those scenarios? And now we're really getting into what we just talked about with that scenario planning. And then have you documented those plans and procedures that are scalable across different crises? Because you know whatever you plan for isn't exactly what happens. So how do we make sure that they're flexible and adaptable enough and scalable enough to be used in multiple ways? And then really at the kind of the cornerstone of this is we started with the mindset and culture, and we're finishing with the culture and looking more at skill sets in the program. Does everyone on your team or do people in your organization that are responsible for managing a risk in any way, are they able to identify risks in real time? Can they quickly assess the potential impact of risk and then respond in a way that increases stakeholder trust and goodwill? So then we're looking really here, moving from crisis readiness to crisis response. But none of this is possible unless we focus and start paying more attention to forecasting and horizon scanning. There are some people who still fight about this. And I'm just like, well, hello, it is now 2025. We need to start leveraging data and analytics. We need to be sensitive to changing stakeholder needs and expectations. You can't be ready if you're waiting until something happens before you do anything. So we need to be ready. So we need to pay attention to what's happening in our industry as well as around the world that might have impacts for us. And this is why we're talking about this constant perma-crisis right now, because we're so used to looking more immediately at our own selves. And now we're being impacted by things that are oftentimes well outside of our control, and we need to be planning for it. ISO 22361, that crisis management and communications guidance document that was published, I think 2 years ago now, put together a very simple framework for crisis management capability where these should look very familiar to you. You need to have committed leadership, you need to have a supportive culture, there should be formal structures in place, and of course your personnel, you not just need to have them, but they should be competent. So we need our leadership to set out those policies and objectives, provide really the resources that we need, and make sure that our objectives are compatible with the strategic direction of the organization. We need to have a culture that we can work in that's committed to crisis management, that encourages the identification of potential warning signs. Really, like, instead of this, like, don't tell me about it till you need to, like, I think this could be coming, we should be looking at this. And this is sometimes called issue management, where you see something out there that could potentially impact your organization and have that assurance of psychological safety and commitment. We need to have those structures of assigned roles and responsibilities and those authority levels, a system for sharing information and knowledge, and making sure, and we're going to talk more about this, that you're integrating crisis management with all other areas of the organizations or functional areas of the organization that manage risk. And of course, we need competent people, and the assignment of those competent people to plan it and as well as manage those crises. When we're looking at command and control and reliance on teams, we look at team structure. All too often, our team structure is determined by our organizational structure, and that's okay if it works. But I think the bigger question is, should the structure of the crisis management team stem from requirements for coordination, communication, and distribution of information? So asking the question is, does your organization determine who's on the crisis management team? Is that dependent on the crisis itself? Do you have a base of people that are responsible and then you add people in based on what that is? And just looking at, is our crisis team structure working for us? And then obviously those teams that you have in place, making sure that you've allowed them to be flexible and you've authorized them to be able to adapt to these evolving complex situations. We know we have plans and procedures, but we need to be able to adjust those plans and procedures when you're facing unpredictable, dynamic, and complex crises or environments. And so you need people who are competent, and part of that competency is, are they able to be adaptive? Are they able to modify where we're going and what we're doing? I'm sure most of you are aware of the purpose of the crisis management team before, during, and after a crisis, but the idea that before you should be analyzing those risks and vulnerabilities, how we're communicating with stakeholders, making sure we have the necessary resources, making sure that the plan is documented and everyone's trained. During, we need to make sure that we're monitoring and analyzing all available information, that we're assessing those potential impacts, that we're activating the appropriate response. Again, communicating with those, you might want to say relevant stakeholders here, but I often will challenge who's relevant and who's not for that, and then coordinating what that response will be. And after, looking at what worked and what didn't, making sure that you're sharing that learning and updating your plans. If you've used up resources, make sure that they're replenished, and making sure that your teams are trained if there's any new procedures. So our next poll is just 3 questions. And just to give a quick snapshot of how mature or capable would you score your organization's crisis management capabilities. And here I will say, you're probably a little bit subjective about this because many of you are responsible for that piece. So that is part of it. We did have a question on what are your thoughts on crisis management plans versus playbooks? So here's the kind of question for me is, if it's something, a playbook is really, really helpful when you're dealing with things that happen all the time. There are regular things that are going to happen, oftentimes weather-related things, where crisis management plans can be a little bit more general. So it looks, I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So most of you are right in the middle, somewhat prepared and capable, and then 38% of you feel very prepared and capable. So that's exciting. Thank you. So I want to next look at these enabling behaviors, we talk about the what. These are the capabilities that you need to have in place. But a lot of times we don't talk about the how do we make that happen. And so this idea of collaboration and coordination is really, really important. And so when we're looking at all the functions that manage risk, we need that to be a collaborative effort. And oftentimes we're now calling that operational resilience, all the different aspects. And that crisis management might actually sometimes be more strategic because we're talking about the reputation side of this, but it's still tied to the fact that crisis management needs to collaborate with all of the different functions that manage risk in order to effectively work across those boundaries and reduce silo or self-type behavior. So things that we're going to dig into incident response a little bit, but things like incident response needs to be very collaborative. We need to make sure that we're talking with our business continuity people, the people that run our data centers and our server rooms and our other critical environments, the people that run our technology systems, our information and cybersecurity systems, our physical security, our legal and regulatory systems, and especially for managing change. I think that this is, I think, being borne out in real time that financial risk management used to be a silo. It was a big silo, and I think it's still a silo in many organizations. But the more recent global crises that we're having with uncertainty and unpredictability of what's going to happen next in the financial industry, in the global financial industry, is having a real impact on everybody's organization. So I think if we're not bringing financial risk management into all the other ways that we manage risk, we're missing a huge opportunity. And at minimum, we should be looking at the financial issues as causing a crisis that might be very different from a crisis that originates from a cybersecurity incident or a supply chain incident. So back to looking at some strategies. We need to implement that systems approach. So when we're looking at being prepared and managing risk, we need to make sure that all of our systems are in alignment with each other, that we're talking to each other, and that we're trying to eliminate silos that might create barriers among those functions. So our first strategic objective is that coordination and alignment of systems. And so making sure that these systems or different functional areas are talking to each other. And that as a system, you're regularly assessing how each one of those areas contributes to the overall resilience of the organization and address those weaknesses where you find them. One way that you can implement a systems approach is at the very beginning and having that unified incident response structure. We've had past webinars that we've talked about this if you're interested in digging down deeper into this, but we're going to just briefly look at it next. But things like having common incident objectives and that joint direction of where you're going. So this is an internal escalation protocol that we've modified from another one that Melissa Agnes has had. Hers is much more complex, but this is just what will fit on a slide that kind of highlights it. Knowing that PowerPoint slide isn't always the best way to present information, but it's what works in this audience. So you've got an incident that's detected. And so somebody needs to notify someone else, what other team, and do an initial analysis by that team. And then ask the question, does this incident potentially exceed our risk appetite or meet an incident or crisis scenario? If no, you get those people, you continue your business as usual, and you continue to respond locally. If you're not sure or maybe, you kind of go on what's called standby, and that assessment team determines the potential scope of the incident. If it's determined yes, then you activate those functional teams and decide, does it meet the criteria for activation for each of those different functional teams? Here is where we're looking at those interdependent crises, that just because it's a supply chain issue doesn't mean it's not impacting other parts of the organization. So looking at everyone who might need to be part of responding to this incident or crisis. So if you're on standby, you continue to monitor for escalation. If it does meet activation criteria, then you activate the parts of the organization that need to be activated and continue to monitor. If it's not quite needing to be activated or it de-escalates, then you can go back to monitoring. But if you do need to activate, you would activate what we call this unified incident response structure, or what's oftentimes called your crisis management team. If you're in the IT world or the government space, you're going to be using much more language about incident response, where if you're in the more business world, you're going to be using the word crisis management team much more often. But it's the same process. It's just different terminology that's being used. So the reason we're talking about communications here, but we're also going to talk about specific crisis communications in a minute. But this idea that we need to be sharing information. So whether you call it your unified incident command or your crisis management team, you need to be talking with all of those teams that have been activated. And so who needs to be a part of that, and how are they going to be playing those roles? We need to make sure that all of your policies include provisions around incident reporting, at a very minimum, what must be reported to whom and at what times. And a lot of times those are regulated, especially if you're in certain industries with security issues or financial issues. That's very much regulated depending on what country you're in as well. We know that those exact reporting requirements are going to vary amongst different organizations and depending on where you are. In fact, if you're a global organization, you might have different requirements by different countries where you're at. But making sure that you've got information sharing as a key priority, and that you're coordinating how you share that information, because even the smallest organizations need to be able to share incident or crisis information in order to deal with those incidents effectively. And so making sure that you're performing that information sharing and communication as your policies require and as your procedures require throughout that life cycle, and you don't wait to share until everything's been fully resolved, because you never know. Maybe this could just be the beginning of something, and if you haven't shared as it's going along, and now we get into more of a perma-crisis piece where we've got many things happening and you're trying to manage all these different aspects, we need to be communicating. Obviously we have legal restrictions for some of the communications that we do, but that's why the communications piece of this is so important. We know that we hardly ever hear people say, oh, I think we over communicated, versus saying, we needed to do this better. We need to improve our communications the next time, or we need to be more secure in our communications to make sure that what we're communicating is getting to the right people and not to the people that shouldn't be getting that. So when you're looking at information sharing in your crisis communications, you need to be very clear on what you're going to communicate. And so whether you have legal or regulatory communications obligations to communicate, but also being careful on what you communicate based on that situation. You need to communicate, but you also don't have to communicate everything that you know. So it's that fine balance, and that's why legal is really an important aspect of this. And by the way, if you're going to ask for a legal input during a crisis, it's going to take some time. So this is why having those crisis scenarios fleshed out and making sure that you've included those communications and that they've already been approved ahead of time, so that they only have to be tweaked and looked at briefly before you can use them, is really important for the timeliness, which ties us to when they should take place. Who your stakeholders are might also determine when that communication takes place to whom, and knowing that social media, no matter how many policies and rules you have, it's going to trump everything, and that's immediate. So having that done ahead of time becomes really, really important. Tied to that, with whom. And so we need to know which interested parties need to know what, and what are their needs and expectations for what they expect us to tell them, and having those communication priorities so that they don't hear about it. Your top level people that you should be talking to first don't hear it from someone else. That becomes a really big trust issue if they hear it from someone else, which ties us to the means of communication. When do you need person-to-person communications? When do you use email? When do you do a broadcast type of communication? And that gets tied then to who are the people that are going to execute those communications. So you can have multiple spokespersons. We often say that the person closest to the stakeholder that you're trying to communicate with should be the communicator, which means you can't just have one or two people trained to do those communications. We need to have more spokespersons than less, and they all need to know who they're communicating with, what their role is, and how that works together. But it isn't just collaboration. When we're talking about being on this crisis management team and communicating, we need to also be inclusive. And I'm not just saying about the overall crisis management team, but all those functional areas. One of the things I find is that when I need advice, I go to the people that I trust, and oftentimes the people that I trust are the people who think like me. So I could say I'm collaborating. Yeah, I've talked to 5 people. It just so happens that I've talked to them because I know they think like me, and they're going to affirm whatever my ideas are. It's comfortable, makes it easier. But we need to be very, and I could have put the word diverse in here as well, but we need to be inclusive in our collaboration primarily, meaning that everybody in your organization needs to feel that they can share information, and that when they share information, it'll be heard and that it'll be valued. And this is really important when you're talking about the responsibility for everyone in your organization to identify risk, and they feel that it's safe for them to share if they've made a mistake and they were able to fix it, but that this mistake could be made again, and or that they've identified what might be a risk and they're not going to be criticized for wasting someone's time. And so there really needs to be this culture of inclusiveness where people feel that they belong and that their information is valued. And then you'll see much better collaboration. I'm sure you've all been in meetings where you've got a team leader talking and talking and talking, and then they ask at the end, do you have any input? Kind of like this webinar. Share your questions at the end. I mean, that's the webinar situation. But if you're in the middle of a crisis, or if you're just having a team meeting, you can't be collaborative unless you give people time to talk. And so making sure that to enable this inclusive collaboration, that team members align on those common goals and those interpersonal norms that ensure success both for the individuals themselves as well as the group as a whole. And so when you're looking at being more inclusive in your collaboration, we're not talking about implementing a new program. We're talking about how we run meetings, how we talk to each other. And so it really gets down to more of a cultural piece than it does necessarily become a crisis management piece. But if your culture is messed up with how we communicate and collaborate, then it's going to impact our crisis, how we manage a crisis as well. So we need to have a culture in the organization that includes inclusive collaboration and really putting in processes in place that encourage open communication. And so identifying that we're going to have a collaborative environment and that everyone is encouraged to ask questions and voice ideas, even if they fall outside of traditional thinking, and that you've got guidelines and modeled behaviors from leaders that encourage those constructive conversations. Like, I had an idea, and then you start talking it through and you're like, well, maybe that's not a great idea. And somebody else says, yeah, but I think we can take this part of your idea and use it. Thank you for sharing. Let's take this piece and run with it. And also having processes for handling and learning from failures. So really being able to talk through those failures, creating those space for those new ideas. And we talk about embracing productive conflict, allowing people to ask questions, and then giving people time to think about that question and how they might answer that. There are many cultures, many places that people work, and I'm sure you can identify with some of these where you just don't ask questions. But sometimes asking a question gets us all thinking in a different direction. And having the permission, maybe I'll say, to ask those questions becomes important. And I will say that oftentimes it's much easier to be collaborative and inclusive in your collaboration when you're in person. But that is not our workforce reality anymore. Obviously, more and more of you are going back to work at least, 2 or 3 days a week if you haven't been back to work full time before. But understanding that not everybody's in the workplace at the same time, and especially during a crisis, we're not in the workplace at the same time. And so when we're having, I'm using quotes here behind Zoom, just like I was thinking when I was writing this that back, I must be old, but when we had copy machines, they were all Xerox. We just said, can you Xerox this versus make a copy of this? So obviously, we've got many different companies that now make copy machines, but that was, that piece. So I'm using Zoom here in the means of whatever um, online meeting tool that you use. Understand that you don't take up as much physical space in a meeting like this, but you can take up airspace. And so if you're running a meeting or if you're part of that meeting, you have to be much more alert to identify problems. And so we have to make sure that we're not being exclusive when we're part of this remote collaboration. So what kinds of things can we do to get the whole team involved in the conversation? Well, the first thing we need to do is to have everybody's cameras on. It's very hard to talk to someone or even know if they want to say anything if you don't see their faces. And this idea of raising hands is so powerful and putting together processes for that. But if you're leading a meeting, I mean, you need to pay attention and you need to get people to talk. And that is not as easy as it is when you're in person and you can just look at someone and they're like, okay, I'll say something. Or you can read somebody's body language that they have something to say. And so when you're in these remote virtual meetings, pay attention to who's speaking and who has the power and how is that power being used. Action. I am actually using satellite internet, which is not very good for communications. So I'm sorry, I'll hold this slide up here for a minute so you can see it. But when you're in a virtual meeting, you also need to pay attention to body language. And so you can't really, people do less eye rolling, I think, virtually. I don't know about slouching. We all have our cameras the way we want to look. Um, but this idea of people interrupting or in an in-person meeting, taking up physical space, we can take up um, talking space. It is really, really frustrating when people talk too much and you can't get a word in. So making sure that you're managing your meetings to allow everybody to have a voice and that everybody speaks in every meeting. However, you can figure out how to do that depending on, who your people are that don't talk and the people are that talk too much. So let's finish up with our final poll. And this is looking at, how much, to what extent do you have a systems approach? And to what extent are you using inclusive collaboration? We're using the same kind of measures that we used in the first one. So we had two questions that came in. One was about reputational risk. And I think the reputational risk is an outcome of just about everything from every other piece of this, that how you manage a crisis or what that crisis is going to impact your reputational risk. You don't get a bad reputation by not doing anything unless you were supposed to do something and you're not doing something caused it. So I see reputational risk or damage to your reputation as an outcome of not managing a crisis. And then that internal escalation piece, who does that initial analysis? And that's where this becomes tricky because it's a it depends answer, and I'm not being able to give you a very good answer for that other than that is a question that needs to be worked out. And the initial answer to that question though is really the person who identified the incident and who that person reports to then needs to know who they should be escalating that to. So having those back in the day, even 15 years ago, your escalation charts I think look very different than they do now, and that those impact areas also look different. So looking at how we can do that. So let's go, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like, actually this one only has 3 choices, so I must not have fixed this one, but totally you're very similar to this approach is 31% of you, In some areas, you've got systems that are working together, and then 9% of you say not at all, that you've got different communication systems. I actually expected that 9% would be higher, because it is very, very common that you've got different systems that are not communicating with each other. In fact, sometimes even different tools for communicating with that. I am encouraged that over 30% of you are very similar to this approach. I feel like we're moving in the right direction. And this is where we really get to talking about resilience. When we're getting to that top piece is where we're getting to be more resilient. So let's look at our communication plan and its relationship with kind of the overall crisis management piece. So we have a general incident response plans, we have our tactical or operational response plans by those functional areas, and then we have a crisis management response. Our communications should be in the middle of that. We should have those communications be tied to all of those. And that crisis communication plan is oftentimes a standalone document so that it can be used regardless of the level or the incident or type of crisis. And then you pulled parts of it that you need. To make it effective, though, we need to be able to manage stakeholder relationships and have a process in place to identify, categorize, and prioritize those key stakeholders. And this is where having this communication, your communication people writing your crisis communication plans becomes really important, because this all needs to be set up ahead of time and how they manage stakeholder relationships. So back to your question about reputation and brand issues, we need to have really good stakeholder relationships because that will make a difference. What are their potential questions that they might ask us? And what are the appropriate means of communicating with them? And then that crisis or that communications team should track which interested parties have been communicated with, when they've communicated with, and by whom, and when the next communication should be. Even just during normal times, what is our pattern of communications? Getting that tracked during normal business time so that then you can know how to escalate that. And then making sure that you've identified and considered the concerns and views of your interested parties. And they give you a list of these here too, that you can make that list as small or long as you'd like. And then when you're looking at your crisis response arrangements, making sure that you've got the capability to assess and understand the factors that are important to all those stakeholder groups, which then could impact your organization's reputation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about reputation here, because we know that communication issues are not an uncommon problem. It is the number one issue that happens at the end of every post-incident or post-crisis conversation is, oh, we should have done this. So making sure that your communications strategy overall is part of your crisis communication strategy. They should be very tied together. It should be very much connected to your organization's goals and those priorities and how they're going to be communicated both internally and externally. So honestly, when you look at your marketing plan, you should be able to see those organizational goals and priorities right from that and what it is that they're paying attention to. And we've talked about the importance of understanding the needs and expectations of your interested parties and communicating with them in a way that's effective for their own interests, really to keep that relationship going, making sure you have enough collaboration tools to be effective and that everybody knows how to use them, making sure you're using metrics. Everything should be tied to data. So using statistics to measure to what extent your tools are being used and effective. You see that all the time with social media. Which type of our social media are we getting the most interaction with? And that should be where you focus your crisis communication pieces. Where can we get the biggest bang for our buck, and reach our largest target audience? And so making sure that you've got those metrics available to you in your normal communication and marketing strategies so that then you can tie that to your crisis communication. And just have this culture of communication. I talked about being inclusive in your collaboration, that they would like you to share information more than they would like you to be quiet, and having that transparency at the executive level that will support that continuous and open dialogue. So here is actually where I screwed up with this. So let's see what I did here, if I fixed this one or not. I actually think what happened was I asked the wrong question. I clicked up the wrong one. I'm just going to skip this poll because this is the one we actually did. So when I went and grabbed the polls, I grabbed the wrong ones. So sorry about that. That's what happens when you're working live. Other questions. I see that examples. Do you see the capability material model framework being used to measure performance? So because my role at ICOR is not in the business world, I can't give you really good examples for that. So that is something where I would ask is, how do you see being this used to measure performance? And really examples of metrics I would really leverage just what I was saying a minute ago about your crisis or your regular communication systems and how they're being used. And then we did have someone say that the sound is cut out, so I apologize if the sound is going in and out. That is on mine. Any other questions that you have before we close up for today? All right, just a reminder, we do have a crisis management communication professional education and certification program, as well as what we have shared in the past about our becoming a leader in resilience and looking at our manager, professional, and executive levels for those responsible for managing risk throughout the organization and leading this organizational resilience effort. Next month, we'll be talking about increasing resilience of your business continuity management system. And just to finish up, please contact us to learn more. And we would be happy if you have any other questions, please use the post-webinar survey to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll respond to you as well. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next month.